Just a community college nurse. That's what the personnel file said, and that was the first mistake. 3 months. Katie Rodriguez had been at Mercy General in Raleigh for exactly 92 days when Dr. Sterling began his afternoon rounds, white coat starched like a flag of surrender nobody had waved yet. He didn't know what he was looking at. He had no idea that the hands adjusting and fall line with the precision of a surgical laser belonged to someone who had threaded catheters into the femoral arteries of dying operators in places the country didn't acknowledge. He didn't know that 18 months of verifiable work history was all that remained after Naval Special Warfare Command had erased 12 years from every database, every record, every official memory. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez simply didn't exist anymore, and that was supposed to be forever. But true absence leaves traces. It leaves muscle memory. It leaves scars. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electrical song above the trauma unit as Katie moved between patient rooms at 2:15 in the afternoon. Antiseptic and floor wax mingled with the faint copper smell of saline drips. Her scrubs were crisp, navy blue with no wrinkles, and her movements were economical, never wasteful, never frantic, just the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that speed and grace were not opposites. She was charting at the main station when Dr. Sterling arrived for afternoon rounds, his shoes clicking against the tile in a rhythm that announced him before his shadow crossed her workstation. The sound grated. It always did. She didn't look up. Dr. Sterling was the kind of beautiful that came from money, the kind that bought good skin care and better tailoring. His jawline could have cut glass, and his smile was practiced in the mirror of every expensive restaurant in Raleigh. The nurses on the unit called him charming when he wasn't listening. When he was, they called him sir. Katie called him nothing at all. She had learned in her first week that speaking to Dr. Sterling without being addressed was a form of insubordination he kept written notes about. The first note had appeared in her personnel mailbox on day 12. She had read it once and thrown it away. That was a mistake. Patient in for 12, Katie said quietly, sliding the chart across the counter toward him without meeting his eyes. Admitted at 0800 with acute diverticulitis. CBC shows elevated white count, 18,400. CT imaging confirms localized perforation. He's on 4-ceftriaxone, 2 grams every 12 hours, and you ordered NPO status at 0900. Dr. Sterling took the chart. His fingers were manicured. Everything about him was manicured. He flipped through the pages with the expression of someone reading a restaurant review, and then something changed. His jaw tightened. The smile didn't disappear, but it became something else, a predator recognizing another predator across a room. He stared at the charting. At her documentation. At the billing code she had flagged because they didn't match the patient's condition, because they never matched the condition, because that was what careful nurses did, they noticed patterns. They wrote them down. They didn't know what those patterns meant, but they noted them anyway, the way someone might photograph a house they felt was haunted without understanding why the light fell wrong on the eastern wall. "You're charting," he said. His voice was like a tank idling in a garage, low and heavy and capable of crushing things. "Who trained you on documentation protocol at your previous position?" Katie's hand stilled on the keyboard. She had worked as a staff nurse at Carolina Medical Center for 18 months before that, a real hospital, with real credentials, with every frame carefully constructed by the military lawyers who had reassigned her. The paper trail was immaculate. The dates were perfect. The recommendations were forged by officers who understood the value of protecting their own. She had nothing to fear from questions about her previous position. She had everything to fear from the way Dr. Sterling was looking at her. "Standard protocol," she said. "Document what the clinical picture shows." "The clinical picture," he repeated. He set the chart down with the precision of someone placing evidence into a case file. Interesting phrase. Most nurses use the word treatment. Or the word orders. He leaned against the station counter, crossing his arms, the fabric of his white coat pulling tight across his shoulders. "I'm going to need you to spend less time documenting and more time following directions. There's a difference between being thorough and being problematic." It wasn't a threat. Not yet. It was a door opening, and Dr. Sterling was standing in the frame, looking down the hallway to see who might be watching. Katie nodded. She had been trained to nod. She had been trained to accept, to defer, to disappear into the background the way a sniper disappears into terrain. But something had shifted in his face when he saw those billing codes. Something had become visible. Something had become threatened. "Understood," she said. He smiled then, a real smile, or as close as Dr. Sterling came to real. "I'm sure you do. You seem like a smart woman, Katie. May I call you Katie?" He didn't wait for an answer. The thing about community college programs is they teach you to question everything. Very democratic. Very American. But in a hospital, we have a different hierarchy. We have a chain of command. He gestured vaguely at his coat. "I'm at the top of that chain in this unit. When I order something, it's not a suggestion. It's not something to be refined or improved. It's done exactly as I say. Can you manage that?" Katie's jaw clenched. Just once. Just barely. The trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint, the kind that comes from being trained in hand-to-hand combat by people who knew that the quietest people were often the most dangerous. She had not trembled in Kandahar when her team was being hunted. She would not tremble now in a Raleigh hospital at the hands of a cardiologist in a $2,000 suit. She breathed in through her nose. She breathed out through her mouth. She looked up at him with eyes that had learned to be blank before she turned 23. "Yes, doctor," she said. He nodded, satisfied. He had drawn blood. He thought he had drawn blood, anyway. What he had actually done was confirm what she had begun to suspect the moment she saw those billing codes, that something was wrong here. That something was being hidden. That her careful charting, her precise documentation, her refusal to move faster than safety allowed, had stumbled onto something that mattered. The question was whether it mattered enough to survive. Dr. Sterling had just made it clear that he didn't think it would. He had just made it clear that he planned to drive her out before she could figure out what she had found. The rounds continued. Katie followed him from room to room, standing 3 feet behind, never contradicting, never suggesting, never speaking unless spoken to. The other nurses watched. The resident watched. The visiting medical students watched, and one of them, a young man with sweat on his upper lip, seemed to be taking notes on how to properly humiliate someone who wasn't fighting back. That was the thing nobody understood about combat training. It wasn't about knowing how to fight. It was about knowing when not to. It was about understanding that the deepest wounds were inflicted slowly, in public, by someone in a position of power, and that the only way to survive was to become invisible even when standing in fluorescent light. By the time Dr. Sterling finished his rounds, it was 3:41 in the afternoon. Katie went to the locker room on the 2nd floor, the one most of the nursing staff avoided because it was too far from the main unit. She opened her locker, number 247, and looked at the gym bag stuffed on the top shelf beneath her spare shoes. She didn't open it. She never opened it at work. But she reached up and touched the canvas, and she felt the leather underneath, and she felt the sand that still clung to the combat boots inside, sand from Ramadi that no amount of washing seemed to remove. The sand from the operating room where she had lost her husband. The sand from the day Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez had officially died. Her hands dropped. She closed the locker. She went back to the unit because there was still an hour left on her shift, and she had learned a long time ago that showing weakness was a luxury she could not afford. But that wasn't the only thing Dr. Sterling had done during those afternoon rounds. While Katie was in the locker room, he had made a phone call from his office. 2 board members owed him referrals, cardiac cases that paid well, private practice partnerships that carried weight. He had called them both. He had explained, in calm and measured tones, that there seemed to be a documentation issue on his unit, a nurse with questionable credentials and a tendency to flag billing practices that didn't concern her. He had mentioned, almost casually, that her previous employment history seemed thin. Very thin. Unusual, even. He had suggested, with the kind of gentle certainty that only rich men possessed, that it might be worth looking into before the hospital found itself in an uncomfortable position. The board members had taken notes. They had promised to investigate. They had no idea what they were actually investigating, but that didn't matter. The machinery had been set in motion. The gears had begun to turn. Katie Rodriguez had been at Mercy General for exactly 92 days when Dr. Sterling decided she needed to disappear. She had no idea that the careful documentation she had been trained to produce, the kind that saved lives and caught mistakes, was the exact thing that would make her a target. She had no idea that those billing codes she had flagged were the threads holding together a scheme worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. She had no idea that she had just 9 days before her world would come apart. But as she stood in the trauma unit at 4:23 in the afternoon, watching Dr. Sterling through the glass of his office, seeing him lean back in his chair with the expression of someone who had just solved a problem, she felt something settle in her chest. Something cold. Something familiar. It was the feeling she had learned to recognize in Kandahar, in Ramadi, in the training grounds of Naval Special Warfare Command. It was the feeling of being hunted. And for the first time in 3 months, Katie Rodriguez stopped being a nurse. She started being something else. 3 months. That was how long Katie Rodriguez had been at Mercy General before the break room became a minefield and her own suggestions turned into ammunition. Room for 12 was where it started, the kind of public humiliation that echoes down hospital corridors long after the patient forgets the conversation ever happened. The Patterson family had gathered like a council of worried saints around their father's bed. 3 adult children, 2 spouses, a grandson who couldn't have been more than 7. The old man lay propped at 30 degrees, his breathing shallow but stable, his infection markers finally dropping after 4 days of broad-spectrum coverage. Katie had reviewed the culture results at 0600 that morning, Streptococcus pneumoniae, fully susceptible to targeted therapy. She charted the recommendation in his electronic file at 0612, documented her clinical reasoning, and waited for Dr. Sterling's morning assessment. He arrived at 0745 with his coat still unbuttoned and his phone already against his ear. He read the chart standing at the foot of the bed. His eyes found Katie's notation. She watched his jaw tighten. Nurse Rodriguez, a moment. Not a request. A command delivered with the kind of inflection that made the entire family's attention sharpen like predators sensing movement. Katie stepped forward. Steady. Professional. The composure she'd built across 12 years in places whose names she could never speak. Dr. Sterling turned to address the room, not Katie. His voice carried the resonance of someone accustomed to being unquestioned, a voice like a tank idling in a garage, powerful, threatening, impossible to ignore. Your father is on an appropriate broad-spectrum regimen, he announced, gesturing at the fall line as if it were a surgical masterpiece. The cultures show excellent response. However, our nursing staff, he paused, a theatrical breath that made Katie's chest tighten, has suggested we narrow coverage based on what they believe the results indicate. I appreciate your community college enthusiasm, Nurse Rodriguez, but perhaps leave the clinical decision-making to those with actual medical degrees. Your charting may be thorough, but competence requires more than following protocols you don't understand. The daughter's face flushed hot pink. The grandson stared at his grandfather. The old man's eyes moved toward Katie, something like apology flickering there. Katie's hand trembled. Just once. A single involuntary betrayal of her autonomic nervous system. She felt it happen, felt the muscle fiber contract against her will, and then she stilled it. One measured breath drawn through her nose. The kind of breath she'd learned in rooms full of men deciding whether to breach a compound or stand down. The kind of breath that came before you made decisions that echoed. One tear escaped her left eye. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with Sterling, her hand moving like she was clearing sweat, not evidence of anything vulnerable. When she spoke, her voice was level, flat, a surface of still water that gave away nothing of what moved beneath. I chart what I see, doctor. The numbers don't lie. She turned and left the room before he could respond, her movements precise, her pace neither hurried nor hesitant. Behind her, Sterling's silence was heavier than any words he might have chosen. The culture results supported targeted therapy. Both of them knew it. The family knew it. And that knowledge, that she was right, that he was wrong, would become the accelerant that fed everything that came next. The break room smelled like the particular despair of institutional microwaves and stale coffee that had been reheated too many times. Katie had unwrapped her sandwich at 1:15 p.m. on Thursday, the day after Sterling's public dissection of her clinical judgment. She'd set it on the faded laminate table with its coffering scars and its broken fluorescent light that buzzed like a trapped wasp. For exactly 90 seconds, she sat alone. Then charge nurse Monica gathered her container. Not slowly. Not with ceremony. With practiced efficiency, the kind of movement that signaled coordination, planning, intention. Monica was followed by Jennifer from the night shift, who was followed by Hassan and then by Dr. Yuki from the resident corps. 5 people. 30 seconds. The sound of their footsteps receding like a coordinated withdrawal, a social demolition executed with precision. Katie sat with her sandwich unwrapped. The bread had begun to dry at the edges. She could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the corner, the distant beep of a monitor 3 floors down through the ventilation system, the ambient white noise of a hospital that never quite stopped working. She ate the sandwich anyway. Slowly. Methodically. Each bite chewed the required number of times. She drank her water from the paper cup. She cleaned up after herself, folding the wrapper into a neat square, disposing of it in the trash can. She did not look away from her food. She did not, under any circumstances, allow anyone who might walk past the break room window to see her react. This was the campaign. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Tactical. Calculated. The kind of social warfare that left no marks visible to administration, no documentation that could appear in a file, nothing that could be called harassment in an official sense. Just nurses leaving when other nurses sat down. Just the quiet redistribution of shift preferences so Katie found herself assigned to the patients other nurses didn't want, the rooms that required the most emotional labor, the cases with the poorest outcomes. On Thursday evening, the bulletin board outside the nursing station displayed a single white sheet of paper with Dr. Sterling's letterhead. His handwriting was bold, aggressive, almost the kind of penmanship that demanded to be seen from the hallway. Katie read it standing in the corridor at 18:47 hours, her shift nearly ended, her body moving on the fumes of 8 hours of unrelenting competence. Disciplinary notice. Employee, K. Rodriguez. Date, Thursday, 1,400 hours. Violations, insubordination and poor clinical judgment. Details, pattern of questioning attending physician orders. Inappropriate clinical recommendations outside scope of nursing practice. Action, formal written warning. Next violation will result in suspension pending investigation. Dr. J. Sterling, attending physician. Katie's back straightened. Her hands came to rest at her sides, steady, utterly still. Her breathing became shallow, not from panic, but from the conscious reduction of visible movement, the kind of stillness that came from training, from learning that the smallest reaction could be weaponized. She read the notice 3 times. Every word. Every accusation. Every implication that her judgment was suspect, her clinical knowledge insufficient, her presence on the unit a liability. Then she removed it from the board. She didn't tear it down in rage. She didn't crumple it. She simply lifted it, folded it with precise creases, and placed it on the desk of the unit manager, Linda Chen. No note. No explanation. Just the return of something that did not belong in public view. But that wasn't the worst part. What Sterling didn't know was that his escalation was visible now. The nurses understood the pattern. The resident physicians understood the pattern. And on Tuesday at 0300 hours, when the emergency department called with an incoming transfer from the VA of a trauma patient, Marine Corps, high-profile case, Dr. Sterling would move too fast, would make the first decision without consulting the board, would dismiss information that contradicted his authority. The ambulance bay doors opened at 0307 hours. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen rolled in on a gurney with a VA combat medic named Torres maintaining pressure on his chest. The chart noted respiratory complications from thoracic trauma sustained 6 months prior in Raleigh. Culture tubes from his recent infection workup accompanied him in a sealed plastic bag. Dr. Sterling took the admission personally, his jaw tight, his movement sharp with the kind of tension that came from knowing a military case meant scrutiny, meant documentation, meant a record that could be reviewed at levels he preferred to avoid. Katie assisted with the transfer to the ICU bay. She connected monitors, oriented herself to his medication list, began the routine surveillance that medical care demanded. By 0630 hours, something had shifted in Chen's presentation. His accessory muscles were working harder, small muscles around his ribs and neck contracting with effort. His agitation had increased despite the mild sedation. His oxygen saturation, despite supplemental O2 running at 4 liters per minute, had drifted from 94 to 89. Katie noted these changes on his monitor strip, documented them in the electronic record, and called for Dr. Sterling. He arrived irritated, already moving toward the door when she described what she'd observed. "He's anxious," Sterling said. "Not a question. Not a consideration. A diagnosis delivered like an order. 2 of it even. Get him comfortable." But Katie's eyes were on Chen's neck. She could see the deviation of his trachea, could see the distension of his jugular veins, could see the pattern of respiratory distress that spelled one specific emergency. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung with air trapped in the chest cavity, compressing his heart, restricting his breathing, a problem that would kill him in minutes if not addressed immediately. She was already moving. Her hands reached for the needle kit on the crash cart, a 14-gauge angiocath needle, the kind designed for exactly this scenario, for the moment when seconds were the only currency that mattered. She didn't ask permission. She didn't call for another nurse to verify the order. She was already prepping the insertion site at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the textbook location for needle decompression, her fingers identifying landmarks the way a pianist found middle C. Torres, the combat medic who'd arrived with Chen, stepped closer. His eyes tracked her hand position, her angle of approach, the confident thrust of the needle into Chen's chest wall. The hiss of air escaping was immediate. Pressure released. A sound like a tire deflating in real time. Chen's oxygen saturation climbed. 89 to 92 to 96. His breathing eased. His agitation dropped. His vital signs stabilized into the range of living instead of dying. Torres leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper, and said something that would echo forward into everything that followed. "Where'd you learn to decompress like that, That's forward surgical team technique." Dr. Sterling's face drained of color. All of it. Every drop of blood retreated from his features like an ocean pulling away from shore. Then the flush came, rage, humiliation, the terrible knowledge that he'd been wrong and that everyone in the ICU bay had watched him be wrong. Katie met his gaze. One measured breath. The kind of composure that came from knowing she'd made the right call and knowing he knew it too. She wiped the sweat from her hands on her scrubs and said only this. "I learned to save lives, not document them to death." The room went dead silent. Dr. Sterling left without responding, his footsteps rapid, purposeful, the pace of someone moving toward a phone call, toward a decision, toward something that would escalate beyond public humiliation and into the machinery of institutional power itself. Katie stood beside Marcus Chen's bed, watching his chest rise and fall with breath that came because she'd moved fast enough, trusted her training enough, acted despite the authority figure telling her to stand down. Around her, the machines hummed their relief. The monitors beeped their confirmation. And somewhere in the building above them, Dr. Sterling was already making calls. He had no idea who he was standing next to. But he was about to find out. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Dr. Sterling closed his office door at precisely 0847 hours. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen had arrived by emergency transfer from the Durham VA Medical Center at 0300 that morning, a Marine with complications from Raleigh injuries that had nearly killed him on Katie's watch. Now Sterling sat behind his mahogany desk, fingers steepled like a man holding a blueprint to someone's destruction. He had already calculated every move. The needle decompression. The textbook precision. The combat-level trauma knowledge displayed by a nurse with only 18 months of documented work history. It was enough. It had to be enough. The first call went to Dr. Hutchins at 0851. Sterling's voice carried the casual confidence of a man calling in a favor owed. Hutchins. Sterling. Need your attention on something sensitive. He didn't wait for a response. We have a credentialing issue in our nursing department. Potential liability exposure. I'm escalating to the board, and I need you present at the discussion. Your cardiac referral network has been profitable for both of us. I'm counting on your support. The line crackled with agreement. Hutchins owed him 3 major referrals, cardiologists commanding 6-figure contracts. The debt was real. The leverage was absolute. By 0856, board member Patricia Wu answered on the second ring. Administrator Walsh recommended me for you, Sterling lied smoothly. We need to discuss a nurse credentialing concern. Thursday board meeting. Your input will be crucial to the institution's liability posture. Wu, who had recommended her own son to Sterling for a residency 2 years ago, said simply, "I'm in." The call lasted 90 seconds. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. The architecture of obligation was already in place. At 0902, Sterling dialed the Human Resources Director at Centara Norfolk General Hospital in Virginia. HR Director Campbell answered on the third ring, her voice professional and measured. This is Dr. Sterling from Mercy General in Raleigh. I'm conducting employment verification on a former staff member of yours, Katie Rodriguez. Registered nurse. I'm reviewing her background for our credentialing committee. There was a pause. A very long pause. I notice her employment records show 18 months with your facility. Is that correct? Campbell's response was careful, institutional. That's accurate, Dr. Sterling. Sterling's voice dropped slightly, the tone of a physician consulting with a colleague on a delicate matter. I'm asking confidentially, off the record, did you have any concerns about her clinical judgment during that period? Any gaps in her employment history before that date? Any unusual competencies that seemed beyond her documented training level? The silence on the line stretched like a taut wire. Campbell, bound by employment law but susceptible to a PIS carefully worded insinuation, offered what he needed, uncertainty. I'm not at liberty to discuss details, but we conducted our own review when she left. There were some questions about her background verification. Sterling smiled. It was all he needed. Questions. Gaps. Doubt. Thank you, Director. That's extremely helpful. The call ended. The seed was planted. The fourth call came at 0918. Brennan, the healthcare consultant, answered immediately. They had worked together before. Sterling had provided billing optimization advice that had netted Brennan a consulting contract worth $340,000 over 3 years. Brennan, I need a favor. A quiet competency audit on one of our clinical staff. Sensitive situation. I need you to review her patient interaction records, flag any patterns that suggest practice beyond her documented scope. Red flags on trauma procedures, advanced clinical confidence that exceeds her paper qualifications. Can you be discreet? Brennan's voice was already shifting into the tone of a hired gun. Timeline, he asked. By end of day tomorrow, Sterling said. I'm presenting to the board. I'll have preliminary findings to you by 1600 hours, Brennan confirmed. The line went dead. By 1000 hours, Brennan was already at Mercy General, sitting in Sterling's office with Katie's patient records spread across the desk like evidence at a crime scene. He worked methodically, highlighting passages, needle decompression performed with precision at second intercostal space, midclavicular line, patient response immediate. Another notation, vital sign escalation managed with textbook timing, O2 saturation climbed from 68 to 94% in under 4 minutes. And another, clinical decision-making demonstrates advanced trauma protocol knowledge inconsistent with documented 18-month work history. Brennan worked like a man building a case. By 12:47 hours, he had flagged 17 patient interactions. By 13:47 hours, he had composed a preliminary report titled Staff Competency Concern, Credential Scope Verification. The language was clinical, precise, devastating. Patient interaction patterns suggest advanced trauma competency inconsistent with documented training and work history. Recommend credentialing review to determine if nurse is practicing within her verified scope of license. Sterling read the report at 1,402 hours. His jaw tightened with something approaching satisfaction. It wasn't the truth. But it was perfectly sufficient to look like the truth. Sufficient to sound like a legitimate institutional concern. Sufficient to justify a suspension pending investigation. Sufficient to keep Katie from ever explaining why a single Marine patient had triggered memories of what she was supposed to have left behind forever. In Trauma Bay 3, Katie sat beside Marcus Chen's bed during her 1,300-hour break. The ventilator wheezed its rhythmic breathing, the mechanical sound of a man suspended between recovery and catastrophe. His daughter Sarah had arrived from Charlotte at 1,800 hours the previous evening, her face wet with relief that the Marine who'd raised her alone, who'd survived 2 combat tours and a 30-year career, had lived. Sarah had asked immediately to meet the nurse who'd saved her father. She was extraordinary, Sarah had said to the charge nurse, her voice breaking. She knew exactly what to do. Like she'd done it 1,000 times before. The charge nurse had smiled carefully and said, "I'll let her know you're asking." But the charge nurse hadn't found Katie. Because at 1,545 hours, Katie had been called to HR. The call had come through the unit intercom. Katie Rodriguez to HR, Katie Rodriguez to HR. She had known, in the way that some people know bad news before the words arrive, that something fundamental had shifted. The tone of the intercom. The specificity of her full name. The 1,545-hour timestamp in the middle of the afternoon, never a good hour for these summonses. She had set down her charting pen, checked Chen's monitors one last time, BP 118/76, heart rate 87, O2 sat 97%, and walked to the 3rd floor with the measured pace of someone who has already survived worse things than an HR conversation. What she didn't know, as she sat in the HR office waiting for Administrator Walsh to arrive, was that Sterling had already called the board. What she didn't know was that at 1,358 hours, Brennan's preliminary report had been hand-delivered to Dr. Hutchins and board member Patricia Wu, each copy marked confidential, credentialing matter. What she didn't know was that Hutchins had called 2 other board members within 15 minutes. What she didn't know was that Sterling had used the phrases credential fraud, liability exposure, and recommend immediate suspension pending investigation in 3 consecutive emails sent at 14:02, 14:17, and 1,431 hours. Sarah Chen had arrived at the nurse's station at 1,620 hours, flowers in hand, asking again to find the nurse who'd saved her father. But instead of finding Katie, she had been directed to the waiting area by the charge nurse, who had received a terse message from HR, Katie Rodriguez is not available. Any inquiries regarding patient care should be directed through administration. Sarah, confused, had called her father's phone. Marcus had woken enough to whisper, "Katie. Find her. Tell her I remember." But Sarah had found only closed doors and polite redirection. In the HR office at 1,545 hours, Katie sat across from Administrator Walsh, whose hands trembled slightly as she opened a file. "Ms. Rodriguez, we need to discuss some concerns about your employment record." The words came like fog rolling across water, present but somehow unreal. "Your background verification shows 18 months of documented work history prior to your employment here. Is that accurate?" Katie's voice, when it came, was steady. Level. "That's correct, Administrator." Walsh's eyes moved across a memo, Brennan's preliminary report, marked up with Sterling's annotations. We've had a preliminary review of your patient interactions, and there are some questions about your clinical decision-making. Specifically, your handling of the Marine Corps patient this morning. Katie's hands remained flat on the armrests of her chair. She did not flinch. She did not blink. I performed standard emergency protocol for a tension pneumothorax, she said quietly. The patient survived. Walsh's voice became even softer, which somehow made it worse. Your technique was extremely advanced. Beyond what we would typically expect from someone with your documented background. The board is concerned that you may be practicing beyond your scope of licensure. The words hung in the air like a diagnosis of something incurable. Katie understood, in that moment, that Sterling had moved beyond mockery and public humiliation. He had moved to the level of institutional weaponization. He had taken the one thing she could never explain, the thing that had kept her alive for 12 years, and made it into evidence against her. I need to speak with my attorney, Katie said. Her voice didn't crack. It didn't tremble. It sounded like someone who had already calculated the angles and found them acceptable. Walsh nodded slowly. That's your right. In the meantime, pending the investigation's completion, we're placing you on administrative suspension effective immediately. You'll need to surrender your badge and access credentials. The security guard was already waiting outside. He had a cardboard box in his hands. The same box, it occurred to Katie, that they'd used to carry Sterling's belongings if things had gone differently. If the system had been designed to protect people like her instead of people like him. The trauma bay froze the moment Marcus Chen's oxygen saturation began its downward slide. 88. 84. The numbers on the monitor fell like a stone dropped into dark water, and the attending physician, a competent surgeon named Dr. Reeves, turned to the ventilator settings, searching for the obvious answer. But Katie saw it in Chen's chest wall. The uneven rise on the left side. The slight bulge at the second intercostal space where pressure was building against his lung like a fist pressing against glass from the inside. Tension pneumothorax. Not textbook obvious. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. She moved before thinking. Hand steady as a surgical laser, she grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, her fingers finding the landmarks on Chen's ribs with the precision of muscle memory that couldn't be unlearned, that lived deeper than conscious thought. Midclavicular line. Second intercostal space. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping was immediate and unmistakable, that single sound that meant the difference between a man breathing and a man suffocating on his own collapsed lung. O2 sat climbed. 90. 92. 96. The visiting combat medic assisting with the examination, a weathered staff sergeant with tattoos creeping up his neck and eyes that had seen things no one should see, leaned close as Katie was withdrawing her hands. His voice was barely a whisper, meant for her alone. Where'd you learn to decompress like that? She didn't answer. She turned instead and met Dr. Sterling's gaze across the bay. His face had gone the color of old bone. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscles working beneath the skin. He wasn't angry about the save. He was angry because she'd just performed a procedure with combat-level precision in front of a Marine Corps staff sergeant, and there was nowhere for him to hide what he'd figured out. This nurse was something other than what 18 months of forged employment history claimed. The silence held for 3 seconds. Long enough for Katie to take one measured breath. Long enough for her to feel the weight of the moment pressing down like deep water. I learned to save lives, Katie said, her voice dropping to that flat, precise register that came from somewhere else entirely, not from the careful, apologetic young woman who'd spent the last 3 months absorbing insults and humiliation in the break room. Not document them to death. The words hung in the air like a held blade. Dr. Sterling's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The combat medic's expression shifted from curiosity to something like respect, the kind of respect that only comes when one trained warrior recognizes another. But by 5 o'clock that afternoon, none of it mattered. Administrator Walsh called her into the small conference room on the 2nd floor. HR Director Kemp was already sitting at the table, a folder open in front of her, her expression arranged in the careful neutrality of someone trained to deliver bad news. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in shades of institutional grey. Katie's hands remained unclenched as she sat down, every muscle in her body aligned for whatever was coming. "We're placing you on immediate suspension," Walsh said, not meeting her eyes. "Pending investigation into credential irregularities and questions regarding your employment history." Katie didn't respond. Kemp pushed the folder across the table. "You've listed 18 months of verifiable nursing experience. Prior to your hire at Mercy General, we contacted your references at Charlotte Memorial. They had minimal recollection of you. Significant gaps in your timeline. And this morning, Dr. Sterling brought to our attention that your performance during the trauma code this afternoon indicated training well beyond what a recent graduate would possess." "The save was correct," Katie said. "That's not the question," Walsh replied. "The question is how you came by those skills. A needle decompression at that level of precision, under that kind of pressure, with that kind of anatomical certainty, you don't get that from 18 months of floor nursing, Senior Chief." The word hung there like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Senior Chief. They didn't say it as a title of respect. They said it as an accusation. "Your badge, please," Kemp said. Katie reached up. The lanyard came away from her neck, the plastic badge cold in her palm. She'd been wearing it for 92 days. She placed it on the table between them and watched it settle there, her photograph looking back at her from behind laminated plastic, a young woman with carefully constructed uncertainty written across her face, someone playing at being someone else. Charge Nurse Monica arrived moments later with a cardboard box. Someone had already cleared Katie's locker. Her spare scrubs. The hand cream she kept in the pocket. The worn combat boots sat on top of the pile, visible to everyone, the sand from Ramadi still caught in the treads, the leather cracked from heat and use and 13 years of operations that no one would ever officially acknowledge had happened. "What investigation?" Katie asked, though she already knew. She'd known the moment Marcus Cheng coded. "You couldn't perform a procedure like that and remain invisible. We can't explain how someone with your credentials possesses combat-level trauma skills," Walsh said. "We're going to need to verify your entire employment history. If there are discrepancies." "There won't be discrepancies," Katie said. "There will be gaps. There are supposed to be gaps." But she couldn't tell them why. Couldn't explain that Operation Copper Dagger had gone sideways in Kandahar, that 6 Navy SEALs had died, that intelligence had been compromised, that the international incident had been barely contained through channels most of these people would never have access to. Naval Special Warfare Command had made that decision for her. After 12 years of service, after every commendation and every classified operation and every time she'd held a dying operator's hand and made the decision to keep him breathing, the Navy had decided she needed to disappear. To never surface. To exist as if those years had never happened. Her service record, deleted. Her awards, sealed. Her identity, buried. The only thing they'd let her keep was a pair of boots. Security guard Davis escorted her from the unit at 1900 hours, during the shift change. The evening staff watched in careful silence as she carried the cardboard box through the hallway, past the nurse's station, past the rooms where she'd spent 92 days learning how to be someone other than herself. No one met her eyes. No one said anything. That was the way these things worked. You were erased, and then people pretended they'd never seen you in the first place. She drove north in the rain, away from Raleigh, toward the coast and Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery. The storm came down in sheets, hammering against the windshield like applause for something no one wanted to celebrate. By the time she parked, mud was soaking through her shoes. She walked through the rows of white headstones with her shoes sinking in the wet ground, past the graves of men she'd served with, men she'd tried to save, men she'd failed. Miguel Rodriguez's headstone was simple. Marble, white, with his name and his rate and his dates. The rain ran down the stone in rivulets like tears that weren't hers. Katie knelt in front of it. Her hand pressed against the cold marble. The rain soaked through her clothes and still she didn't move. I tried to stay invisible like they ordered. Am I a more? She whispered. Her voice was barely audible above the sound of the storm. But I failed you. I failed everyone. They erased you. They erased me. And I couldn't even keep the one thing left, the work. The only thing I had left was saving lives, and that's what got me caught. She stayed there until her knees were numb, until the rain had run cold down her neck, until the lightning stopped flashing and the storm moved inland. When she finally stood, the combat boots in the cardboard box waited in her truck like evidence of everything she'd been forced to become. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Sterling was already making calls. That night, Katie stood in the rain at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery with her hand pressed against cold granite. Miguel Rodriguez. SEAL Team 3. The headstone was wet under her fingertips, the inscription worn by salt and time. 12 years of service, 2 tours through Kandahar, and a classified operation in 2012 that erased them both from every database, him to a pine box, her to a ghost. The rain hammered down like it was angry, like the sky itself wanted to punish her for being alive when he wasn't. She whispered through her tears, her voice fractured and raw. I tried to stay invisible like they ordered. Am I a more? I tried to disappear completely. But I failed you. I failed everyone. The words dissolved into the storm. Around her, Arlington-identical headstones stretched into the darkness, thousands of them, each one a silence that nobody wanted to hear. 3 days later, at 0600 hours on Friday morning, Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen regained consciousness in the trauma ICU. His eyes snapped open like someone flipping a switch. The ventilator still hissed its mechanical rhythm, the oxygen saturation monitor beeped steadily at 97, but his pupils tracked. Present. Alive. The charge nurse, Jessica, leaned in to check his pupils and Marcus's hand shot up, grabbing her wrist with a grip like a vice. His voice came out broken from the breathing tube, barely more than a whisper through the tape. Reaper. That was it. One word. Jessica's hands trembled, she didn't understand. She'd never served, never heard the call sign, never knew what it meant. But somewhere in this hospital, Katie Rodriguez heard the name spoken in her sleep and woke with her fist clenched around the breathing tube of a patient 3 floors away. Within an hour, Sarah Chen, Marcus's grown daughter, stood in Administrator Helen Walsh's office. Sarah had been a soldier herself, 68 Whiskey, Army combat medic, 3 rotations through forward operating bases. She knew military when she saw it. She knew training when she watched someone work. And she knew exactly who had saved her father's life. She placed a folder on the desk, the military file she'd requested through a family friend with Pentagon connections. That nurse who saved my father, Sarah said, her voice steady as a rifle barrel. You suspended a senior chief petty officer. Administrator Walsh opened the folder. Her hands began to tremble. Navy Cross. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. Photographs of Katie in desert camouflage, face painted for night operations, weapons hanging like second skin. Code names. Operational theaters that were redacted into black boxes. The document was stamped declassified, for official use only at the bottom of every page. Walsh looked up, her face gone pale. The next voice she heard was a knock on the office door. Commander Brent Hawke entered, barrel-chested, his civilian suit tailored but his bearing unmistakable, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. 2 staff sergeants in dress uniform flanked him. He didn't ask permission to sit. He simply looked at Administrator Walsh with eyes like stone and spoke with the measured precision of a man used to being obeyed. Senior Chief Rodriguez served under my command for 11 years. Navy Cross for Valor in Kandahar, 2010. 2 Purple Hearts, 1 from shrapnel, 1 from a direct impact that should have killed her. He paused. Sarah Chen nodded once, her eyes fixed on the administrator. Silver Star for actions in Ramadi in 2012. She ran combat medical operations in places this country will never officially acknowledge. Each medal landed like a punch. Navy Cross. Silver star. Purple hearts. The words hung in the air like they had weight, like they displaced the oxygen. Commander Hawk's voice dropped another register. When you suspended her, Administrator Walsh, you suspended a woman who has saved more lives than anyone in this hospital will ever know. She treated casualties in forward operating bases with 2 hours of sleep and a knife as her only surgical tool. And she never, once, looked at the body count. Sarah Chen spoke again, her father's blood in her veins and her training in her shoulders. My father said she moved like someone who had done this 1,000 times. Like her hands remembered what her mind was trying to forget. You tried to destroy her because she was too good. Special Agent Marcus Morales from the FBI stepped forward, no introduction, no handshake. He placed a folder on the desk with the kind of deliberate slowness that meant bad things were inside. Dr. Sterling submitted 247 billing codes for procedures not performed over the last 18 months. Diagnostic imaging that never happened. Orthopedic consultations that were never provided. Equipment charges that ran up to $180,000 in kickbacks from Consolidated Medical Supply in direct exchange for exclusive equipment orders placed through Mercy General's procurement department without competitive bidding. Administrator Walsh's face cycled through colors like a traffic light. Morales continued, his voice without inflection. Senior Chief Rodriguez's charting flagged every single discrepancy. Her documentation was so precise that it caught what 3 separate audits from the Hospital Compliance Office missed over 18 months. She was trained to chart field operations where one error produces a war crimes investigation. Her standards were infinitely higher than his. Board member Dr. Hutchins, who sat frozen in the corner, suddenly stood. His chair scraped against tile with a sound like surrender. I was not aware of, you signed off on 12 supply contracts without competitive bidding, Morales interrupted, not looking at him. Your signature is on every authorization form. You received consulting fees totaling $34,000. Hutchins sat back down slowly, like his bones had become too heavy for his body to support. Sarah Chen looked directly at Dr. Sterling where he stood near the window, his face dissolving into ashen panic. You tried to destroy the woman who saved my father's life because she was good at her job. Because her competence threatened your incompetence. Her voice wasn't angry. It was worse than anger, it was statement of fact. She performed a needle decompression in the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, with no hesitation and no error. She saved his life in the time it took to make a phone call. And you couldn't handle being shown up. Dr. Sterling's mouth opened. No words came. He tried again. I advocated for high standards. I had legitimate concerns about her credential verification. She arrived with only 18 months of documented employment history. There were legitimate questions about her background. Administrator Walsh looked at him with something that looked like revulsion. She read from the FBI file, her voice shaking. You contacted 2 board members within 4 hours of her charting your first discrepancy. You called her previous employer at County General and explicitly stated you had concerns about her clinical judgment. You hired Dr. Whitmore as an outside consultant and provided him with a list of incidents to investigate, all of which were normal nursing decisions. You manufactured a termination case within 48 hours. She paused. All before her suspension was even filed. The silence in the room was so thick you could operate in it. Security guard Marcus Davis appeared in the doorway holding a cardboard box, the same box Katie had been handed 3 days earlier. The walk was identical. The expression on his face was different now, though. Something like satisfaction. He approached Dr. Sterling with the slow deliberation of someone savoring a moment he'd been waiting for. Dr. Sterling, I'll need your hospital badge, your access cards, and your office keys. I believe you know the way out, sir. The words hung in the air like an echo. Dr. Sterling's hands fumbled as he removed his badge, his access cards, his keys. Each item went into the box with a soft clink. The room watched in complete silence as he placed them down, his movements jerky and fragmented, his face a mask of disbelief that was cracking at the edges. When he tried to speak, "This is a misunderstanding, there are extenuating circumstances," "My attorney will." Nobody listened. Nobody responded. He walked past Commander Hawk without acknowledgement. Past Sarah Chen without a glance. Past Administrator Walsh, who had already picked up the phone to call the hospital's board chair. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent. His footsteps echoed down the hallway. That was the end of Dr. Sterling at Mercy General Hospital. 6 months later, Katie Rodriguez walked through the entrance at 0900 hours on a Tuesday morning. She wore jeans and a simple blouse, and her hair was down for the first time anyone in the hospital had ever seen it. She'd been working part-time for 3 months now, trauma protocol consulting, emergency staff training, the kind of work that didn't require her to be someone else. Work where her competence was acknowledged instead of questioned. Work where her hands could do what they were trained to do without someone claiming it was beyond her credentials. The worn combat boots sat in her locker on the top shelf, visible to anyone who opened the door. Ramadi sand still caught in the treads. Not hidden. Not shameful. Honored. Present. Real. Charge nurse Monica greeted her with a warmth that had been missing during those first 3 months. Senior Chief. Good to have you back. 3 other nurses approached with apologies that Katie waved away without speaking. Actions mattered more than words. That afternoon, Katie trained 12 emergency staff nurses on the needle decompression technique in the conference room. Her voice was steady and certain, no hesitation, no deferential softening. Landmark is the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Prepare the 14-gauge catheter. Insert at a 90-degree angle until you hear the hiss of air escaping. That's your confirmation of pneumothorax. A nurse raised her hand. Katie paused, waiting. How do you practice this without actually hurting someone? Katie's mouth twitched, almost a smile. You don't. You trust your training. And you remember that no practice is as important as the understanding that you're saving a life. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen sat in the back row with his daughter Sarah. His lungs were still rebuilding, but he was breathing on his own now. Alive. He watched Katie demonstrate each step with the precision of someone who'd done it in conditions that would break most people. He understood what she was. What she'd been. What she always would be. When the training ended, he approached her quietly and placed a coin in her hand, a challenge coin from SEAL Team 3. Welcome home, Senior Chief, he said. Nothing else needed to be said. Commander Brent Hawk visited Mercy General on a Thursday, carrying a shadow box with 2 purple hearts, a silver star, and the Navy Cross gleaming against black velvet. The ceremony was small, staff room, trauma unit, about 30 people. He opened the box and spoke without ceremony. Senior Chief Rodriguez served in darkness so others could live in light. She continued that service even when ordered to disappear. She did what her country asked, even when it cost her everything. The medals were mounted in the frame with Katie's service record, redacted where necessary but unmistakable. She hung it in the trauma unit staff room where every nurse would see it every morning. When asked to speak, Katie's voice was quiet and certain. True class is what you do when the lights go out. The room erupted in applause that didn't stop for a long time. Down at Wake Technical Community College, Dr. Sterling stood in fluorescent-lit classroom number 147 teaching CPR certification to a group of 20 board students, most of them mandatory hospital employees fulfilling continuing education requirements. His medical license was suspended pending federal trial. His hospital privileges were revoked. His co-conspirators on the board had resigned. His salary had dropped from $320,000 annually to $16 an hour, cash hourly rate, no benefits. He wore a polo shirt with the college logo now instead of his pressed white coat. His wedding ring was gone. His second marriage had ended the week his name appeared in the news. He demonstrated chest compressions on a CPR dummy with mechanical precision but no presence, no authority. Nobody in that classroom respected him. Nobody ever would again. And he spent every teaching session waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the federal indictment to become official, waiting for the prison sentence, waiting for his fall to reach bottom. Katie stood at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery again on a Thursday evening, placing fresh flowers on Miguel's headstone. The rain had stopped. The sun was setting across the Arlington Hills, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. I surfaced. "Am I a Moor?" she whispered, her hand on the cold stone. "And I'm still standing." She didn't cry this time. The tears had happened in the rain. Now there was only the simple truth of survival. The simple truth of having kept her oath, even when ordered to break it. She stayed until the sun disappeared completely, then drove back to the city where she lived now, not hiding, not running, not erased. Present. Real. Home. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, or if you've ever had to rebuild yourself from nothing, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment and let me know, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Your story matters. And if you want to see more stories about quiet warriors who serve in the dark, hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thank you for listening.